Okay, do you want to get started?
Sir. Cool. Just before we get started, there's a few important links that we should be aware of. So there's the setting up your coding environment, and the slides can also be accessed at that URL. And there's React documentation in there as well.
Okay.
Cool. And the check-in code should be React's.
Yeah. And let us know if that doesn't work. I think that's the right one though. Okay, yeah. So just to get started for this workshop, the only thing you really need is Node.js, and you can run npm -- version to check you already have it installed, and then an IDE would be helpful, but not mandatory.
Cool. Today's agenda will essentially be going through what is React and sort of why we should be using it. Next, we'll be covering setting up a basic React project and just basically setting up the boilerplate for that. Then we'll also be covering the basic building blocks of React, which are React components. And lastly, we'll be sort of going through a demo as we're going through the slides as well. Cool. So we'll just get it started. And what is React? React is essentially a JavaScript library for building dynamic and interactive user interfaces. It was created by Facebook and released in 2013. Next slide first. And basically, I'm going to be covering why use React, why should we use React, and why is it sort of important. Basically, we cover React. Some of the advantages would be like it's super fast and scalable. You're able to create dynamic web pages a lot easier, and there's a lot of reusability of components. And there's also a lot of broad community support because, React is super popular and there's a lot of documentation online as well. One of the cons for React would be due to the rapid growth of React and its popularity shooting up, and just the rapid advancements of React, it might be hard to find great documentation, that documents all the complex features of React. Another complaint I've also heard about React is that JXS can be kind of confusing and difficult. Cool. So how does React sort of work behind the scenes? Essentially, if you guys were there for the last workshop, for the JavaScript workshop, basically what the DOM is essentially a tree structure of nodes representing the structure of a web page. And this is sort of, it's a tree structure, and basically it takes a while to load. And for React to be efficient, why is React so efficient and fast at this? It's because React essentially has a copy of the DOM, which is called the virtual DOM, and really only updates when there's specific elements that are changed. Instead of re-rendering the entire DOM each time, which could be costly and expensive, it'll compare basically whenever there's like a sort of change. And then if there's a difference, it'll only update that specific node in the DOM. Cool, and this is just sort of a diagram representing this. Cool. Ferris, do you want to cover starting up a React project?
Yeah, so to start a React project, we usually use this command npx create React app, and then we would give it a name for our project. And this is basically like an easy way to set up some boilerplate, so we're not really starting from zero. And we're going to be going through a demo, so I can do that right now. Can you guys see the whole screen?
Yep.
Okay. So I go to my desktop. I can run the command, and let's call it hack school 4. And that's going to take a second, so we can move on for now. Wait until that finishes. So one of the cool things about React is that you can kind of mimic the structure of HTML a lot closer when you create your components. So it offers the syntax JSX, which is basically like HTML markup that you're returning, but you can put in your JavaScript directly inside and basically like write everything a lot more accurately to how you would do it in like vanilla HTML. And so React uses something called Babel to like transpile it down to basic code. And we have a quick demo here. So yeah, so if we give a JSX expression, so basic div with a header tag and h2, then we use these curly braces in order to insert JavaScript expressions. And it basically compiles that down to like pure JavaScript, which can be like rendered in the document. Okay. And it's still not done. Okay, yeah. So components are basically like the building block of React projects. And each component is like a single reusable piece of the interface. And that allows us to like scale a lot better. And yeah, so we have an example right here. So most web pages on the internet can be seen through the lens of components. So if we look at Twitter, we can view like the nav bar kind of as like one component, and then the main feed for the users, and then this news on the right side. And then those are kind of just like top level. So we also have like everything inside. So like the like button or the retweet, and these are all like reusable pieces. So we can generate as many things as we need with them and use them to modify our page very dynamically. So in React, there are two main ways of writing components that we're going to get into a little later. So the first way is a little bit older. That's with class components, which would extend the React component class. And they give us a render method where we can return what we want that component to display on the page. And they come with a lot of like built-in lifecycle methods. And those are really useful for knowing like when we want to trigger certain actions. But the more modern way is with functional components, which are a little bit more lightweight, and they just have the structure of a function. And the return value is the JSX expression. And we prefer hooks instead of lifecycle methods when we're doing that. So this is an example of a basic class component. So we would define the class and give our component a name. And then we would have a render method that returns some JSX. And we would be able to insert JavaScript in here as we need. We could also define other stuff outside that do like calculations and use that however we need. And then the same component as a functional component. So if you came to our last workshop, you might be familiar with the arrow function notation. Basically, we take in our parameters, and in this case, we don't have any, and then we have the arrow, and then inside the body, we have a return statement, which is just going to be the same expression. So if you compare the two, the functional version is a lot shorter, and it makes your code a little bit cleaner if you're writing a lot of these components. Do you want to cover this part, Ryan?
Yeah, cool. So basically, the way React works is essentially whenever a component is rendered, there's sort of a set of lifecycle methods that essentially they go through, right? And so it's essentially similar to event listeners for vanilla HTML elements. And these are sort of the steps, I guess, the three different categories of lifecycle methods. There's one, which is mounting. So this is what happens. These are the set of methods that run essentially when a React element is created. So it will essentially go through component will mount, then it will essentially render the element and put it on the actual DOM. Another category of lifecycle methods would be updating, which is essentially what happens when there's already a component on the page and there might be like a change, such as like a state change or some update to that component, which will trigger these set of lifecycle methods in updating. And lastly, the third category would be unmounting, is when you remove a component from the screen. That's sort of the methods that will run.
Yeah, and then, so before we move forward, I think, so the project finished installing. So if we open this folder, we can take a look at like the structure it gives us a little bit. Okay, so you notice immediately we have 3 main folders. So the first one, node modules, is kind of all the libraries that come pre-installed, and you normally don't need to worry about that. And then public folder comes with an index.html file, which is kind of like the actual base of our project. And if you notice, there's like no code in here really, besides this div root. And inside the source, so if you look in the index.js file, we actually have this line, which is kind of like the starting point for everything. So React takes that root div and will render your whole project inside of that as a child. So if we open a terminal, we can actually run the project by running npm start. And I'll open it up locally on a live server for us to view, just for like testing and everything. Might take a second. I don't know, thought it was going to be quicker. Yeah, so while that loads, we have a component here called app, which is going to be like the base parent component of our whole app. And JavaScript uses like a module system. So when we have anything in a file and we want to use it in other files, we have this statement export default, and then we name it. And if we go back to the index file, we can import that file and get the function we just defined and display it here using like basic HTML tags. Okay, it's going very slowly. Okay, yeah, so this is the basic boilerplate it gives you when you start the project. Okay, yeah, so back to the lifecycle methods. We're gonna start our demo of the counter component and just make like a basic app that can start like counting with a button and increment and decrement. And we're gonna get some practice using some of these methods. So in our app.js component, we can remove all of this for now. And we're actually going to be doing this with class components first, just to get practice. So we want to import React and component from React. And then I guess, sorry, I'm going to, I guess we'll call it app for now. So inside of our class, we're going to have a render function, which is going to return some JSX expression. And for now, you can see if we just write hello world and export the app, then over here, then we get that expression in our browser. And yeah, that's basically the only thing in it so far. So if we add in a couple of the other functions, so component did mount, then we can just add some console log statements to show us kind of like what's happening. So component did mount is basically when it renders for the first time, and then component did update would be every time something changes and it has to re-render. Okay, yeah. So for our actual counter component, we're going to start out with a div because JSX expressions can only have one parent element, basically. So if we tried to do something like this, and if we tried to put two adjacent elements, it would throw this error and tell us that's not allowed. So in our div, we just want an h1 that has a current count. And for now, we can just say that's 0. And then if we make a button, we can allow it to increment. We can make another button that allows us to decrement. So back in our browser, we see this. Now, if we open our console, we can see that component mounted, so that printed, and then nothing really changed. So we never called component did update yet. Okay, so the next part is state. Yeah, okay, so I can cover this. So React components can handle data in like two ways. And the first of these is by storing their own state. And this is basically like storing local variables inside the object. And that can basically determine how they're going to render the information in them and behave. And so the state is going to be local to every component. So if you have like two different instances of this counter component, then they're each going to have a separate like state just for them, so they can function like independently. And the main thing you want to know about state is that the React component is going to automatically update when its state changes. So that's going to trigger a re-render, and we don't have to manually worry about that or anything. So if we want to add state into an object, we would call it in this constructor like this. And we would have a state instance variable that stores all the properties as key values in this object. So yeah, so back to our demo. You can add that now. In our constructor, we can say this.state equals, and for now we just want a count. So now using our state, we have access to that here in our render method, and we can call this.state.count and use that to determine what we're going to display basically. And back to our demo. Something broke. So I think we have to call super. Yeah. Okay, so basically if we change the state here, then it's going to reflect in the component because that's where it's pulling it from. But right now, these buttons still don't work and we can't modify them. So the next thing we're going to cover is event handlers, and I'm going to do this right.
So essentially, event handlers are functions that determine what actions to take when an action or event is fired off. So some examples of events or actions that could occur would be something like a button click or just random scrolls in a certain area. These would essentially trigger events, and I guess these are events, and event handlers are the way to handle those events. And so event handlers work in a similar fashion to JavaScript, except that this is essentially the difference between vanilla HTML and sort of how that would work in an HTML format versus in React.
Yeah, so basically in JavaScript, functions are like first-class citizens, which means you can pass them directly as like variables or objects as like parameters to different functions. So if we just pass the name of the function, then this button can like call it whenever it needs to. Okay, so yeah, so back to our demo. So now if we have these two buttons, we need them to actually work. So we can define our functions here. And we can use arrow notation just to make it a little cleaner. That's going to take no arguments because we don't have anything we need it to take. And then we would call this dot set state as this is like a function that's given to us because we're extending the component class. And then basically what we want to do is say set the state equal to this updated object, which is just going to have the count is equal to this dot state dot count -1. Now, if we want to actually use this, we have to set an onClick event for this button, and we would just give it the function name. And notice, like, if we gave it parentheses here, that would be like calling the function and using a return value. So I actually don't want to do that in this case. So back to our demo. If we have that, then it decrements every time. We can do the same thing for increment. And also, does anyone have questions so far? Just like anything in general? Yeah, so now that's working. And we should probably set this back to 0 for our initial value. And then another thing you can notice is actually it prints out component updated every time we push a button because it's re-rendering the whole component. And one other cool thing is, I think there's a Chrome extension called React Developer Tools. If you download that, it gives you this tab right here, components. And why is it blank? Okay, so yeah, so we only have one component in our project right now, which is basically the app. And it tells us we have all these properties in our state. Right now it's just count. And every time we push something, that actually changes. This is really useful for debugging and kind of just seeing like the whole tree of all the components you have and all the state they're storing when things get a little more complicated. So yeah, so second way of handling data is through props or like properties. And instead of storing the values in the actual component, we can pass them in through the constructor or the function parameters as like the arguments. So in class components, we would do this in the constructor. We would take the properties and we would call super to give it to the component constructor also. And then we have access to it throughout our class, and we can reference it using the syntax. And to actually pass in that property, when we create the component, we would just pass it in like we do in vanilla HTML with the property name here, and then the value we give it right here. And then with functional components, we would do it like a regular function. So we take in the property and then we call props.name, and that would get the name key and the value associated with it. So if we do that now, we can just add in props right here and super that. And then for the properties, we could say, let's say it's like let's say we have a label, so we could like actually customize it or something. Then whenever we use this component, we could add in that property. And if we just write that, then it would get passed in as the property, and it would, yeah, so it would use a value. Notice it's a little bit different. And then over here in the actual properties, we can see that that's the only property being passed in. Yeah, okay, so what's next? Okay, yeah. So the next big thing is hooks. And this is like particularly useful when we're dealing with functional components. And hooks are basically just like a cleaner way to handle the component lifecycle rather than the way we do it in classes and like these huge functions. Like we typically do like component did mount and did update are like the main two. And when you're dealing with like large code bases, that can get a lot more like unwieldy. And we can basically hook into these features through a layer of abstraction, and we don't have to deal with issues of scope. And yeah, that's basically just in functional components. So first hook that we use a lot is useState, kind of to mimic the same actions we just took with the state object. And it's going to take an initial value and return a list with 2 arguments that gives us a value and a setter function for the value. And the value can be used to get that current state of the variable, and we can call that function with the value we want to update it to set it to something else. So in order to use this, we have to import it from React. And yeah, so it's just a single function. We could use curly braces as like a destructuring argument. And yeah, so if we call useState false, it's going to set the initial state to false if clicked, and it's going to give us a variable and a setter function. And yeah, so if we have an event handler right here, then we can call set clicked, which is going to update the value for us. So we wouldn't do it manually, like saying clicked equals false, because we kind of let like React maintain control of it because it handles rendering asynchronously, and we'll get an error if we try to do it otherwise. And this is basically just toggling it, so flipping it from on to off, off to on. And then, yeah, so we bind our event handler on click to this toggle function. So every time we click this div, it's going to flip it. Yeah, and then like I mentioned before, if you try to pass the function with parentheses, it would just try to use a return value, which isn't what we want. We want to pass it back to a function object, which can be called later. Okay, and then, yeah, another big hook is useEffect, which kind of like replicates the behavior of component did mount and did update all in one. And it defines a function that runs on the initial load when we render the component and on certain reloads, so not necessarily every single one. And it takes a function as the first argument and an optional second argument as a dependency array. And we can use this to load data, update information, and a bunch of other stuff. So same syntax, we would import it from React. And then we would typically call it at like the top of our function. And so what this is saying is we want to use this effect, which is calling this function an arrow notation that just prints out this is a new render. And it's going to print that out based on the dependency array every time that changes. So if num renders changes, then this use effect hook is triggered again. Yeah, so dependency array is optional, but you might get some bugs with infinite loops if you don't include that. And yeah, that was kind of everything we had. So that was just like a little bit of the basics. And we covered components, props, states, hooks, and event handlers. But React goes a lot deeper. Like Ryan mentioned, there's like a lot of community sourced libraries and very well documented stuff to help you. And I guess before we go, we could refactor the counter component we had into a functional component just to show you the other way and make it a little bit cleaner. So actually going to split screen and have this open at the same time. So we want to write this as a functional component. You could do it in a separate file called counter. And first thing we always have to do is import React. So we are going to import React from React and then define it as a function. So counter equals function with a return value that's going to be a JSX expression. And then inside of that, we have our div, and then kind of like the same structure we had before. You can actually just copy in all of this code. And so now we don't have this state variable, so we need to introduce count in a different way. And the way we do that is with the useState hook. So we import that hook first. Then we can define count and a function set count as the return value from this useState, which would have an initial value of 0. So starting our count on 0, then this function would update it for us. And then I guess the next two functions we have to define are increment and decrement. So in decrement, we would want to decrease it by 1. We would call set count. We could pass count minus 1 as the argument. And then similarly in increment, we would call set count with count plus 1. And so, yeah, so then we could also refactor the props. So instead of using a constructor, we can pass it in directly to our function and then take our label through the props object. And now if we actually want to use this in our file instead, we would have to export it. We would write export default counter and then we import that here. So we don't have to use .js because we're using modules, so kind of knows already. And then inside here, we can use our counter component instead. And that should render the same. And since we didn't pass it any props, the label's missing. So if we do that again, then it should have our label again. And then if we have multiple components, so if you actually duplicate it, then we get more of them. Notice like it's very quick to make more of them and scale this way. And each one of them has its own state kind of. And yeah. Okay, so I think, yeah, that was all we had. So thank you everyone for coming. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask us now. We'll be around for a little bit. Otherwise, yeah, if you have any other workshops you'd like to see, you can use this URL, and all the slides are available to review right here. And the recording will be uploaded soon.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks for coming.